The rain had stopped hours before dawn, leaving North Seattle in that particular stillness that belongs only to the coldest part of morning. The streets lay empty under a sky the color of wet cement, and the houses along the residential blocks sat dark and quiet, their windows reflecting nothing. It was the kind of silence that made sounds travel farther than they should, the kind that amplified the creak of a gate or the distant hum of an early delivery truck. In one of those houses, a two-story suburban structure with a well-kept lawn and a mailbox that read Whitlock, the lights had been off for hours. The neighbors knew the man who lived there as a hospital director, someone whose name appeared in local health articles and charity event programs. They had seen him leave early and return late, always in professional attire, always with the measured demeanor of someone who carried responsibility. What they had not seen was what federal agents had been watching for months through surveillance cameras, financial tracers, and encrypted communication intercepts. They had not seen the pattern that emerged when charity donations were cross-referenced with cartel money flows, or the way certain shipments moved through the city's port system without proper inspection. They had not seen the names that appeared in coded emails or the surgical instruments ordered in quantities no single practice could justify. The investigation had started small, a tip from an informant in Tijuana who mentioned a doctor in the Pacific Northwest, and it had grown into something federal coordinators described in briefings as structurally sophisticated. By the time the operation received final authorization, more than 200 agents had been assigned to various points across King County, Pierce County, and the waterfront industrial zones near Everett. The target was not simply one man. It was a network that had embedded itself into the civic framework of Seattle, using medical authority as both shield and weapon. And at 5:14 in the morning, that network was about to collapse. The battering ram hit the front door of Dr. Lawrence Whitlock's home with a sound that seemed to crack the entire neighborhood open. Federal agents poured through the entrance in a coordinated surge, voices sharp and overlapping, commands echoing through the hallway as boots struck hardwood floors. The house looked ordinary at first, almost aggressively normal. Family photographs lined the walls in matching frames. Diplomas hung in the study. A coffee mug sat beside the kitchen sink. It was the kind of home that suggested stability, the kind that neighbors would describe as quiet and respectable. But federal raids are not built on surface appearances. They are built on evidence, on months of financial analysis and intercepted communications, on the kind of details that only become visible when someone is looking for them. And the agents who moved through Whitlock's home that morning were looking for everything. They found the first cage in the garage, a locked cabinet that contained modified firearms, short-barrel rifles with filed serial numbers, handguns wrapped in oiled cloth. Ammunition is stored in crates marked with symbols federal analysts had seen before in cartel seizures along the southern border. The weapons alone would have been enough to justify the raid, but it was what lay beneath the house, down a narrow staircase that led to a basement larger than the blueprints suggested, that turned the operation into something else entirely. The surgical suite was hidden behind a false wall, accessed through a storage closet that appeared to hold nothing more than old furniture and cardboard boxes. When agents pulled the shelving unit aside, the room beyond came into view like a vision from a nightmare dressed in clinical precision. Stainless steel tables stood under overhead surgical lights, their surfaces clean and recently used. Medical instruments were arranged on trays with the kind of order that suggested routine, that suggested repetition. There were monitors, IV stands, trays of syringes, and a refrigeration unit humming in the corner. And there, stacked in vacuum-sealed bricks along the far wall, were 50 pounds of heroin. The discovery triggered an immediate escalation in the federal response. What had been planned as a high-priority arrest became a multi-agency crisis operation, and within minutes, communication lines were opened to DEA field offices ICE, Homeland Security Investigations, and the FBI's Organized Crime Division. Whitlock himself was found in the upstairs bedroom, still in pajamas, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder and colder as agents placed him in restraints. He said nothing, not a word of protest, not a question, not of denial. He simply stared at the agents with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly what has been lost. Downstairs, forensic teams began the process of cataloging evidence, photographing every angle of the surgical suite, tagging each instrument, each vial, each brick of narcotics. The heroin was pharmaceutical grade, the kind used in hospitals before synthetic alternatives became standard, and its presence in a private basement raised immediate questions about supply chains, about access, about how long this operation had been running. But it was the documents found in Whitlock's office that began to reveal the true scope of what federal investigators had uncovered. There were patient files that matched no hospital records, financial ledgers that listed payments under vague medical terminology, and a series of encrypted emails that, once decoded, revealed a language of logistics and movement. Messages that reference shipments, border coordination, and something the agents found particularly chilling, projected use value assigned to individual human beings. The emails were time-stamped, cross-referenced with port schedules, and linked to bank accounts in 3 countries. They painted a picture not of a lone criminal, but of a man who had built an infrastructure, who had used his position as a hospital director to create access points that criminal organizations could never reach on their own. And as the sun began to rise over North Seattle, casting pale light through the windows of Whitlock's home, federal commanders were already coordinating the next phase of the operation. Because the documents made one thing clear: the network was still active, and the next shipment was already in motion. The evidence pulled from Whitlock's residence filled 3 transport vans and required a dedicated forensic team working in shifts to process. Bank statements revealed 23 shell corporations spread across Nevada, Belize, and Panama, entities with no staff, no physical addresses, no inventory, yet millions of dollars moving through them in transactions disguised as medical procurement fees and charitable donations. The corporations had been registered using variations of legitimate medical terms, names that sounded official enough to pass a cursory audit, but vague enough to avoid specific regulatory oversight. Money flowed in from intermediaries in Caracas and Guadalajara, filtered through layers of financial obfuscation, and emerged on the other side as grants, consulting fees, and equipment purchases that never resulted in actual deliveries. Forensic accountants traced the funds backward and forward, mapping a web of transactions that stretched across 5 years and involved banks in jurisdictions known for lax oversight. The pattern was consistent. Small amounts moving frequently, always below thresholds that would trigger automatic reporting, always structured to appear legitimate. But when aggregated, the sums were staggering. Over $37 million had passed through Whitlock's network, and investigators were still finding accounts. What made the financial architecture particularly insidious was how it leveraged Whitlock's position within Seattle's medical community. As a hospital director, he had access to city health boards, regional medical councils, and public-private partnerships designed to improve healthcare infrastructure. He sat on committees that reviewed grant applications, approved facility expansions, and coordinated with federal agencies on public health initiatives. That access gave him something most criminals could never obtain: legitimacy. He could meet with port officials to discuss medical supply logistics. He could coordinate with inspectors on facility compliance. He could influence procurement decisions and staffing assignments. And all of it, every meeting, every signature, every recommendation, carried the weight of institutional authority. The encrypted communications found on his devices painted an even darker picture. Messages to individuals identified only by initials or code names, discussing movements that investigators quickly realized were not about supplies or equipment. Move the patients tonight. Border team ready. Logistics confirmed for the morning shift. These were not metaphors, they were instructions, and the folder labeled logistics left no room for interpretation. Inside that folder were transport schedules for 9 individuals, complete with medical notations, blood types, and something that made even seasoned federal agents pause, use value assessments. Each person was listed with a destination, a time frame, and a projected financial return. The documents were clinical in their precision, devoid of any acknowledgement that the subjects were human beings. They were assets, inventory, elements in a supply chain that treated life as commodity. Beside the folder was a ledger outlining the next major shipment: 1 ton of heroin, 1.5 tons of methamphetamine and fentanyl, scheduled to move through Washington's ferry system before sunrise. The routes were mapped in detail, noting container numbers, refrigerated truck assignments, and personnel responsible for each segment of the transport. The shipment was not theoretical. It was active, already in motion, and the timeline suggested it would reach its distribution points within hours. Federal coordinators cross-referenced the ledger with port records and found discrepancies that confirmed what they had suspected. Certain containers had been waived through inspection, signed off by employees whose names appeared in Whitlock's financial records. Security footage from the port showed trucks arriving at unusual hours, loading procedures that bypassed standard protocols, and individuals whose faces matched known cartel operatives. The operation was not improvised. It was systematic, built on relationships that Whitlock had cultivated over years, using his medical credentials to open doors that would have remained closed to anyone else. And as federal analysts pieced together the full picture, a grim realization settled over the operations center. Whitlock was not an accessory to cartel activity. He was a foundational pillar of it, someone who had weaponized the trust placed in medical professionals to construct a trafficking network that moved drugs, money, and people with surgical efficiency. The question was no longer what Whitlock had done. It was how much damage had already been inflicted, and whether the network could be dismantled before the next shipment disappeared into the distribution channels that fed addiction and death across the Pacific Northwest. The answer to that question was being decided in real time in warehouses near the Everett waterfront, where 9 human beings waited in the dark, unaware that federal forces were already moving toward them. By 3:40 in the morning, the Joint Operations Center in Seattle had transformed into something resembling a war room. Maps covered every available wall, marked with collared pins indicating target locations, federal asset positions, and known cartel surveillance points. Communication lines were open to FBI hostage rescue teams, DEA fast units, ICE Homeland Security Investigations, and local SWAT coordinators who had been briefed on the operations classification level. The intelligence was no longer fragmented, it was absolute. 9 kidnapped individuals were being held in a warehouse near the Everett port, a structure that aerial surveillance had identified as heavily fortified, with rooftop access points and interior modifications inconsistent with standard industrial use. Thermal imaging showed multiple heat signatures, some stationary in a way that suggested restraint, others moving in patterns consistent with armed patrols. The cartel was not taking chances. They had turned the warehouse into a defensible position, something built to withstand assault long enough for reinforcements to arrive or evidence to be destroyed. The second target was even more urgent. A convoy of refrigerated trucks was preparing to move the narcotics shipment, and the window for interception was closing. If the trucks reached the interstate, they would scatter across multiple routes, making simultaneous interdiction nearly impossible. The decision matrix was brutal. Attempt a coordinated duelist strike, risking that failure at one site could compromise the other, or prioritize the hostages and let the drugs move, knowing they would fuel overdoses, gang violence, and the kind of societal erosion that takes years to repair. Federal commanders made the only choice their oaths would allow. They would hit both targets simultaneously, and they would do it with overwhelming force. The convoy of unmarked federal vehicles moved through the pre-dawn darkness without sirens, without lights, a column of tactical force rolling silently toward the Everett waterfront. Inside the lead vehicle, the hostage rescue team leader reviewed the final assault plan on a tablet, his face illuminated by the blue glow of thermal overlays and structural diagrams. The warehouse was a maze, and the cartel knew it. They had stacked shipping containers to create choke points, positioned firing lanes that would force attackers into exposed positions, and fortified the interior with makeshift barriers that could turn a straightforward breach into a protracted gunfight. The rules of engagement were clear. Lethal force was authorized against armed hostiles, but the priority was the hostages. 9 lives depended on precision, on speed, on the kind of coordinated violence that federal tactical units train for but hope never to deploy on American soil. As the convoy approached the industrial zone, the first sign of trouble appeared. Rooftop silhouettes, 2 figures with rifles watching the access road. The cartel had posted sentries, which meant they were expecting trouble, which meant the element of surprise was already compromised. The team leader's voice came through the comms, low and controlled. All units, we are detected. Execute on my mark. The vehicles accelerated, closing the distance in seconds, and the night exploded into action. A breaching charge detonated against the warehouse's eastern wall, a percussion blast that sent metal sheeting flying in twisted fragments. The sound rolled across the port like thunder, and before the echo faded, federal agents were pouring through the breach, moving in disciplined formations that had been drilled into muscle memory. Gunfire erupted immediately, muzzle flashes lighting the warehouse interior in stroboscopic bursts. Bullets struck concrete pillars, ricochetted off steel beams, and tore through the air in a chaos of sound and fury. The cartel had fortified the interior with firing ports cut into shipping containers, creating overlapping fields of fire that forced the assault teams to advance under constant pressure. An FBI sniper positioned outside found his angle through a broken skylight, his scope settling on a hostile repositioning a scoped rifle on a catwalk. One shot and the figure dropped. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of industrial debris repurposed into tactical obstacles. Forklifts had been overturned to form barricades, chemical drums stacked into bunkers, and the lighting had been sabotaged, leaving only emergency strips casting dim red light across the scene. The agents advanced through the darkness, using night vision and thermal imaging to distinguish targets from hostages, every step calculated against the threat of ambush. The firefight intensified as cartel gunmen began using the warehouse's vertical space, firing from catwalks and elevated platforms that gave them tactical advantage. Federal agents returned fire with disciplined bursts, their training evident in the way they moved, covering each other's advances, using smoke grenades to obscure their positions, and maintaining communication even as the noise reached deafening levels. A flashbang grenade rolled under a conveyor belt, and when it detonated, the blast shook the rafters and sent a plume of dust cascading from the ceiling. In that moment of disorientation, hostage rescue team members pushed forward, closing the distance to a cluster of shipping containers that intelligence had identified as the most likely holding area. 2 cartel gunmen charged from behind a stack of crates, weapons raised, and the engagement turned into close-quarters combat, muscle flashes so close they illuminated faces in harsh, fleeting detail. The agents' shields took the impact, ballistic protection absorbing rounds that would have been lethal, and return fire dropped both hostiles before they could adjust their aim. On the southwest side of the warehouse, ICE agents encountered the hostages being moved toward a refrigerated truck, a last-ditch attempt to evacuate the human cargo before the facility fell. A cartel enforcer opened fire, his shots wild but forcing the agents into cover. The Canuvi unit was released, a German Shepherd moving with speed and precision, hitting the gunman before he could reload and taking him to the ground with a force that ended the threat. The agents moved to the hostages, cutting restraints, speaking in calm, authoritative tones designed to cut through trauma and fear. 9 people, their faces marked by exhaustion and terror, blinking in the harsh light of tactical flashlights, alive. Outside, the perimeter erupted into its own battle. 3 cartel trucks roared to life, engines screaming, attempting to ram through the federal cordon. The first truck hit a chain-link gate, sparks flying as metal tore, and for a moment it looked like it might break through. The armored vehicle swerved into its path, agents firing at the tires, and the truck skidded sideways, slamming into a cargo container with enough force to crumple the front end. The second truck tried to follow, but coordinated fire from multiple federal positions shredded its engine block, smoke pouring from under the hood as it ground to a halt. The third truck's driver saw the futility, threw the vehicle into reverse, and was intercepted by agents who had circled behind, cutting off retreat. The helicopter spotlight switched on, a column of white light blazing down from above, turning the battlefield into a theater of exposure. Fleeing figures became visible, abandoned weapons glinted on the pavement, and the raw mechanics of a collapsing criminal operation were laid bare under that unforgiving illumination. Inside the warehouse, federal agents reached the final container, the one marked in Whitlock's encrypted communications with a designation that matched the hostage logistics folder. The lock was industrial grade, designed to resist cutting, but the team had come prepared. Bolt cutters reinforced for hydraulic pressure bit into the metal, and with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The doors swung open, revealing the interior, and what the agents saw confirmed every grim prediction. 9 hostages, bound with zip ties, huddled against the container's rear wall, their faces gaunt and eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from prolonged captivity. Medical supplies were scattered on the floor, IV bags and syringes suggesting the captives had been kept sedated or treated for injuries sustained during abduction. The agents moved quickly, cutting restraints, wrapping the hostages in thermal blankets, speaking in tones that balanced urgency with reassurance. Medics were already moving in, triage protocols activated, assessing each individual for injuries that required immediate intervention. Outside, the last of the cartel resistance collapsed. The final gunman, cornered behind a shipping container, threw down his rifle and raised his hands, his face slick with sweat and his body shaking as federal agents closed in. He was taken into custody without further struggle, added to the growing number of detainees being secured in transport vehicles. By the time the sun began to rise over the Everett waterfront, the scene was one of overwhelming tactical success and staggering evidentiary volume. 2.5 tons of narcotics had been seized, 1 ton of heroin and 1.5 tons of methamphetamine and fentanyl, all packaged for distribution. 324 weapons were cataloged, ranging from compact handguns to rifles modified for automatic fire. Bundles of cash, gold certificates, and offshore banking documents totaling $52 million were secured before they could be moved into untraceable accounts. But the most important statistic was not measured in kilos or currency, it was measured in lives. 9 human beings, stolen from their families, marked for exploitation or worse, were now safe. They were transported under federal guard to the University of Washington Medical Center, where trauma specialists were waiting to provide care that extended beyond physical injuries. The psychological damage would take longer to address, but for now they were alive, and the machinery that had intended to destroy them was shattered. The aftermath of the Everett operation rippled through federal agencies with a speed and intensity that surprised even seasoned investigators. Within hours, the evidence began to reveal a network far more extensive than initial intelligence had suggested. The laptops, encrypted phones, patient files, and financial ledgers seized from both Whitlock's home and the warehouse were laid out in the FBI's Seattle field office, and forensic analysts began the painstaking work of cross-referencing every document, every transaction, every communication. A pattern emerged almost immediately, one that extended beyond Whitlock and the cartel operatives now in custody. The network had roots in Seattle's civic infrastructure, tendrils that reached into municipal offices, law enforcement, port administration, and even other medical facilities. Investigators identified 20 public officials whose names appeared in Whitlock's encrypted communications and financial records. These were not minor functionaries. They were individuals with authority, people whose approvals carried weight, whose signatures could expedite processes or halt them entirely. A deputy sheriff in Pierce County had received recurring payments labeled as security consulting, amounts that totaled over $200,000 across 3 years. The payments coincided with periods when cartel shipments moved through the region without interdiction, and internal investigation revealed that the deputy had access to law enforcement communication channels that would have provided advance warning of raids or increased patrols. A city health inspector in Seattle appeared in financial records as a recipient of monthly transfers described as facility compliance fees. His inspection schedule aligned almost perfectly with the arrival of refrigerated containers at the port, and he had signed off on storage facilities that later proved to be holding points for narcotics and trafficking victims. A port employee, someone with authority to approve container manifests and override standard inspection protocols, had received payments through a shell corporation that traced back to Whitlock's network. Surveillance footage showed this employee waving through trucks at hours when the port was otherwise quiet, and shipping records revealed that containers flagged for agricultural inspection had been reclassified as medical supplies, bypassing scrutiny. Even more troubling was the discovery of a second surgeon, a physician at a hospital in Tacoma, whose encrypted communications with Whitlock discussed special transfers and post-procedure compensation. The language was clinical, almost sterile, but federal investigators recognized it for what it was: discussions of organ harvesting and black market transplants. The transactions were meticulously documented, each one small enough to avoid triggering financial audits, but when aggregated over 5 years, they totaled $37.9 million flowing through medical donation initiatives that looked legitimate on paper but served as conduits for cartel money. These were not mistakes. They were not accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate choices made by people who understood exactly what their cooperation enabled, who saw the money and decided that whatever happened in the warehouses, the basements, the refrigerated trucks was someone else's problem. The public reaction when the news broke was one of profound disbelief, mixed with a deeper, angrier recognition. Dr. Lawrence Whitlock had been a public figure in Seattle's medical community, someone who delivered speeches at healthcare conferences, awarded scholarships to nursing students, and appeared in local news articles praising his hospital's commitment to underserved populations. Residents remembered his face from charity events, his signature on donation acknowledgments, his quotes in articles about improving regional healthcare access. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could the same man who spoke about community wellness have been operating a trafficking network that moved drugs, organs, and human beings through the Pacific Northwest? But as federal prosecutors began releasing details, the dissonance gave way to a colder understanding. Whitlock's public persona had not been separate from his criminal activities. It had been integral to them. His position gave him access that career criminals could never achieve, credibility that opened doors and disarmed suspicion. When he met with city officials, they saw a hospital director. When he coordinated with port authorities, they saw a medical logistics expert. When he influenced grant committees, they saw a dedicated public servant. The mask had been perfect because it was built from real credentials, real authority, real institutional power. Inside Seattle's municipal offices, the revelation triggered institutional panic. Emergency meetings were convened. Supervisors demanded audits of every department that had interacted with Whitlock or his network. and the scope of the investigation expanded to include anyone who had signed off on approvals, grants, or inspections related to his activities. Hospital administrators initiated comprehensive reviews of transplant programs, donor records, and surgical partnerships. Every contract Whitlock had signed was pulled from archives and subjected to forensic accounting. Port authorities shut down entire terminals pending security reviews, and the economic impact was immediate, with shipping delays cascading through supply chains. Police departments launched internal investigations into officers whose names appeared in federal documents. And the Seattle Police Officers Guild issued a statement condemning any member found to have cooperated with criminal organizations. In Olympia, state legislators called for hearings on oversight gaps that had allowed a hospital director to build a trafficking infrastructure without detection. The questions were pointed and uncomfortable. How had millions of dollars moved through charitable organizations without triggering audits? How had inspection protocols been bypassed without anyone noticing a pattern? How had a network involving 20 public officials operated for 5 years before federal agencies, not local oversight, exposed it?
For Seattle's older residents, people who had lived through decades of urban change and had seen their city grow from a regional hub into a major metropolitan area, the betrayal struck at something fundamental.
These were not abstract failures. They were personal. They were the difference between a system that protected its people and one that had been quietly rotting from within, held together by appearances while corruption spread through its foundations.
The institutional reckoning extended beyond Seattle into federal courtrooms, where prosecutors prepared what would become one of the most comprehensive corruption and trafficking cases in Washington state's recent history.
The evidence was overwhelming not just in volume, but in specificity. Every charge was supported by documentation, by encrypted messages that had been decoded and verified, by financial transactions that left digital trails across multiple jurisdictions, by surveillance footage that captured faces and actions, by the testimony of 9 rescued hostages who could describe their captivity in detail. 31 individuals were indicted: cartel enforcers, logistics coordinators, transport brokers, and the public employees who had facilitated the network's operations. Each indictment laid out a narrative of deliberate criminality, of choices made with full knowledge of consequences. The deputy sheriff who had provided intelligence to the cartel was charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The health inspector was charged with accepting bribes and violating public trust. The port employee faced charges related to smuggling and money laundering. The surgeon from Tacoma was indicted on organ trafficking charges, and the evidence included medical records that matched bodies found in cartel-controlled territories across the border. But the most extensive charges were reserved for Dr. Lawrence Whitlock. Federal prosecutors filed a 43-count indictment covering drug trafficking, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, financial crimes, organ harvesting, and public corruption. The document was 217 pages long and included appendices that detailed every transaction, every communication, every approval that had allowed his network to function. His arraignment drew a crowd so large that federal marshals closed the courthouse steps, establishing a perimeter to manage the overflow. Older residents stood behind barricades, some holding photographs of family members lost to overdoses, others simply bearing witness to the collapse of someone they had been taught to trust. When Whitlock was led into the courtroom, his appearance was startling. The confident hospital director was gone, replaced by a man in an orange jumpsuit, his face drawn, his eyes avoiding the gallery. The federal magistrate read the charges in a voice that allowed no inflection, no judgment, only the mechanical recitation of alleged crimes. The bail hearing lasted less than 10 minutes. The prosecution argued flight risk, citing offshore accounts and cartel connections, and the magistrate agreed.
Whitlock was remanded to federal custody pending trial, and as marshals led him from the courtroom, the only sound was the shuffle of his feet and the quiet weeping of someone in the gallery who had once worked under him, who had believed in his mission, who could not reconcile the man she knew with the charges she had just heard. The investigative work continued long after the initial arrests as federal analysts worked to map the full extent of the network's operations. Shell corporations were traced through layers of obfuscation, revealing connections to entities in 6 countries. Bank accounts were frozen, assets seized, and the financial architecture that had allowed millions of dollars to move undetected was systematically dismantled. Interviews with low-level cartel operatives provided additional intelligence, filling gaps in the timeline, confirming suspicions, and occasionally revealing details that opened new investigative threads. One operative, facing life imprisonment, described how Whitlock had personally overseen the surgical chamber in his basement, performing procedures on trafficking victims to extract organs that would be transported south for black market transplants.
The description was clinical, detached, as if recounting a factory process rather than something done to human beings.
Another operative detailed how the ferry system had been used to move narcotics, describing specific routes, times, and personnel who had been bribed to look away. The testimony was corroborated by surveillance footage and manifests that showed containers moving through the system with timestamps that matched cartel communications. As the evidence accumulated, a clearer picture emerged of how the network had functioned. Whitlock had not built it overnight. He had spent years cultivating relationships, identifying vulnerabilities in oversight systems, placing people in positions where their cooperation would be most valuable. He had used his medical credentials to establish legitimacy, his charitable work to build goodwill, and his institutional access to create pathways that criminals normally could never exploit. It was a strategy that relied on patience, on the understanding that trust takes years to build and only moments to weaponize.
And it had worked, right up until the moment federal investigators began connecting transactions that should have remained separate, until encrypted communications were coded,
until the surgical chamber was discovered and the facade collapsed completely. The lesson was not lost on federal officials who began implementing new oversight protocols for charitable medical organizations, enhanced scrutiny for public employees with access to critical infrastructure, and interagency communication systems designed to identify patterns that might indicate similar networks elsewhere.
The reforms were necessary, but they came with the bitter acknowledgement that they were reactive, implemented only after the damage had been done, after lives had been lost, after a community's trust had been shattered.
In Seattle's City Hall, the aftermath manifested in a series of tense, often angry public meetings where residents demanded accountability from officials who had failed to detect Whitlock's network. The meetings were packed, standing room only, with older residents particularly vocal in their frustration. These were people who had spent decades engaging with civic institutions, paying taxes, voting in local elections, trusting that the systems designed to protect them were functioning as intended.
The revelation that a hospital director had operated a trafficking network for 5 years involving 20 public officials was not just a security failure, it was a betrayal of the social contract. City council members faced questions they struggled to answer. How had oversight mechanisms failed so completely? Why had no internal audits flagged the financial irregularities?
Why had complaints from nurses about unusual supply orders been dismissed? The answers, when they came, were unsatisfying. Oversight had been distributed across too many departments, no single entity responsible for comprehensive review. Audits had been periodic rather than continuous, allowing patterns to develop between review cycles. Complaints had been filed but not escalated, treated as administrative matters rather than potential indicators of criminal activity. The systemic failures were not malicious, but they were profound, revealing an infrastructure that had prioritized efficiency and cost reduction over the kind of rigorous scrutiny that might have caught Whitlock earlier. Hospital administrators faced their own reckoning as medical staff who had worked under Whitlock came forward with observations that, in hindsight, should have raised alarms. Unusual surgical requests that bypassed standard approval processes, equipment orders that exceeded departmental needs, patient transfers that were not logged in official records. Each detail taken alone might have been explained away, but collectively, they formed a pattern that should have triggered investigation. The failure was not just regulatory, it was cultural, a work environment where questioning authority was discouraged, where efficiency was valued over scrutiny, where the assumption of good faith extended to everyone with credentials and institutional backing. That assumption had allowed Whitlock to operate with impunity, and the consequences were now being measured in seized narcotics, recovered weapons, rescued hostages, and the 31 individuals facing federal charges. The federal courtroom where Dr. Lawrence Whitlock would eventually stand trial became, in the months following his arrest,
A symbol of something larger than a single case.
the empty bench, the nameplate reading United States District Court, the flag standing at attention, all of it represented a system that had been tested and, despite profound failures, had ultimately held.
The charges against Whitlock were among the most serious that federal prosecutors could bring, and the trial preparation involved coordination across multiple agencies, jurisdictions, and areas of law.
Prosecutors knew that the case would be watched not just by Seattle residents, but by communities across the country grappling with similar questions about institutional corruption and the exploitation of public trust. The defense strategy, when it emerged, attempted to shift focus from Whitlock's actions to the broader systemic failures that had allowed the network to develop. Defense attorneys argued that their client had been operating within a system that lacked adequate oversight, that the shell corporations and financial structures had been reviewed and approved by banks and regulatory agencies, that the charitable initiatives had been publicly praised by city officials. The argument was not that Whitlock was innocent, but that the responsibility for the network's operations extended far beyond one individual. Federal prosecutors countered with the evidence, and the evidence was damning. Encrypted communications showed Whitlock giving direct orders to cartel operatives. Financial records showed him personally authorizing payments to public officials. The surgical chamber in his basement, the weapons cache, the 50 pounds of heroin, these were not systemic failures. They were individual choices. The testimony of the 9 rescued hostages would be particularly powerful. Their accounts of captivity, of medical procedures performed without consent, of the clinical detachment with which they were treated, would provide the human dimension that transformed abstract charges into visceral reality. As the trial date approached, the federal prosecutor leading the case reflected on what the proceedings would mean for Seattle.
The verdict, whatever it would be, would not undo the damage. It would not restore the lives disrupted by addiction fed by Whitlock's narcotics pipeline.
It would not erase the trauma experienced by trafficking victims. But it would affirm something essential, that authority does not place anyone above accountability, that the same system which had failed to prevent Whitlock's network could still function to dismantle it and seek justice.
The community response, in the weeks and months following the raids, revealed something about resilience that official reports could never capture.
Neighborhood groups organized forums on recognizing signs of trafficking, on understanding how criminal networks exploit institutional gaps, on advocating for stronger oversight without succumbing to paranoia. Older residents, those with the longest memory of Seattle's evolution, spoke about the importance of remaining engaged even when institutions failed, of understanding that vigilance was not a temporary response to crisis, but a permanent civic responsibility. Younger residents, particularly those in medical fields,
grappled with the dissonance between their professional training and the reality that someone with Whitlock's credentials had weaponized medical authority for criminal purposes. Medical schools incorporated ethics modules focused on recognizing corruption, on understanding how institutional power could be exploited, on the importance of reporting irregularities even when doing so challenged hierarchical norms. The changes were incremental but meaningful, reflecting a community's determination to learn from failure without allowing that failure to define its future. Federal officials reviewing the case from Washington, D.C. recognized it as a template for understanding how organized crime adapts to modern institutional structures. Whitlock's network had not relied on violence or intimidation as its primary tools, though both were present when necessary. Instead, it had relied on legitimacy, on the exploitation of trust, on the strategic placement of cooperative individuals in positions where their authority could be leveraged. It was a model that other criminal organizations would study and potentially replicate, which meant the lessons from Seattle needed to be disseminated across federal law enforcement, incorporated into training programs, used to inform policy discussions about oversight and accountability. The Everett warehouse, scene of the dramatic federal assault, was demolished 6 months after the raid. The land was purchased by a logistics company with no criminal ties, but before the structure came down, federal investigators conducted a final walkthrough, documenting every detail for future reference. The building had been a theater of violence and rescue, and its destruction felt like a necessary closing of a chapter, though the story it represented would continue in courtrooms and policy discussions for years. The trial of Dr. Lawrence Whitlock began on a cold morning in March, 9 months after the initial raid on his North Seattle home. The federal courthouse was filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside despite freezing rain. Inside, the courtroom felt heavy with anticipation. Every seat occupied, federal marshals positioned at strategic points, the jury selected after weeks of voir dire designed to find individuals who could evaluate evidence without preconception. The prosecution's opening statement was direct and devastating, laying out a narrative of deliberate criminality that spanned 5 years and involved the systematic exploitation of medical authority for cartel operations. The evidence presentation took 4 weeks, with forensic accountants explaining the financial networks, encrypted communication specialists walking through the coded messages, federal agents describing the raids and rescues, and finally, the 9 hostages testifying about their captivity. Their accounts were delivered with varying degrees of composure, some clinical, some emotional, all profoundly damaging to the defense's attempts to minimize Whitlock's personal responsibility. The medical procedures described, performed without consent, designed to assess suitability for organ harvesting, were detailed in testimony that left the jury visibly shaken. The defense attempted to counter with arguments about systemic failures, about the complicity of public officials who had approved Whitlock's activities, about the lack of oversight that should have caught irregularities earlier. But the prosecutor's rebuttal was simple. Whitlock had built the system. He had recruited the officials. He had established the shell corporations, directed the cartel operations, and personally overseen the surgical chamber where trafficking victims were assessed for their use value. The verdict, when it came after 11 days of deliberation, was unanimous on all 43 counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months later, but the outcome was never in doubt. Federal sentencing guidelines for the combined charges effectively guaranteed life imprisonment without possibility of parole. When the sentence was formally pronounced, Whitlock showed no reaction, his face a mask that had become familiar during the trial. He was led from the courtroom in restraints, and the door closed behind him with a finality that resonated through the gallery. The completion of Whitlock's trial did not end the prosecutions. The 30 other individuals indicted in connection with the network faced their own legal proceedings, some choosing to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, others mounting defenses that ranged from denial to claims of coercion. The deputy sheriff pled guilty and received a 20-year sentence.
The health inspector went to trial and was convicted, receiving 15 years.
The port employee cooperated extensively, providing testimony that helped prosecutors understand the logistics of how containers move through the system, and received a reduced sentence of 8 years.
The surgeon from Tacoma fought the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming, and he was convicted on all counts, receiving a sentence of 25 years.
The cartel operatives, those directly involved in the trafficking and distribution, faced the harshest sentences, with several receiving life terms.
The legal proceedings stretched across 2 years, each trial adding detail to the public understanding of how the network had functioned. By the time the final convictions were secured, the case had become a reference point in legal and law enforcement circles, studied in criminal justice programs, discussed in policy conferences, cited in proposals for enhanced oversight of charitable medical organizations. The institutional reforms implemented in Seattle became models for other cities, though implementation was uneven, subject to the same resource constraints and bureaucratic inertia that had contributed to the original failures. The reforms were necessary but insufficient, reactive measures that addressed known vulnerabilities while leaving others unexplored. The lesson, repeated by federal officials and Seattle residents alike, was that vigilance could not be episodic. It had to be continuous, embedded in institutional culture, supported by resources and political will.
Anything less created the conditions for future Whitlocks, future networks that would exploit whatever gaps remained.
3 years after the initial raid, Seattle had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The hospital where Whitlock had worked underwent complete administrative restructuring, with new leadership implementing protocols designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority he had wielded.
Port security was enhanced with randomized inspections and AI-assisted analysis of shipping patterns designed to identify anomalies.
City offices implemented cross-departmental review systems for approvals related to public health and safety, ensuring that no single official could expedite processes without scrutiny. But the deeper changes were cultural, harder to quantify but no less significant.
There was a wariness in civic engagement, a recognition that institutional trust had been weaponized and that the price of security was eternal skepticism balanced against the need to believe in collective systems.
Older residents, those who remembered Seattle before the case, spoke about a loss of innocence that sounded almost quaint but felt profound.
The understanding that a hospital director could build a trafficking network using charitable donations and medical credentials had fundamentally altered how they engaged with institutions.
The assumption of good faith, once automatic, was now provisional, subject to verification. Younger residents, those who had grown up with awareness of institutional corruption as a given rather than an aberration, approached the changes with pragmatic acceptance. For them, the Whitlock case was less a shocking revelation than a confirmation of suspicions they had held about power and its capacity for exploitation. The generational divide in perception was evident in community meetings, where older voices emphasized the need for restored trust and younger voices pushed for accountability mechanisms that assumed bad faith until proven otherwise. The synthesis of those perspectives, never fully achieved but constantly negotiated, became the foundation for Seattle's evolving civic culture. The federal agents who had led the raids, particularly those involved in the Everett warehouse assault, carried their own reckonings. Several received commendations for their actions, formal recognition of tactical excellence and courage under fire. But the commendations came with an understanding that the operation's success had been measured against profound systemic failure.
They had rescued 9 hostages, seized tons of narcotics, dismantled a trafficking network, and arrested 31 individuals.
But they had also confronted the reality that the network had operated for 5 years, that oversight systems had failed, that public officials had been complicit, and that the damage inflicted during those years was irreversible. The agents who interacted with the rescued hostages during their recovery were particularly affected, witnessing the long-term trauma that persisted despite physical healing. Several left federal service after the case, moving into private security or teaching, seeking distance from operations that required confronting the worst of human capacity. Others doubled down, viewing the case as validation of their work's necessity, as evidence that however imperfect the response, it was still infinitely better than inaction. The philosophical divide was never fully resolved, but it informed how federal agencies approach similar investigations with an emphasis on earlier intervention, on not waiting until networks were so entrenched that their dismantling required the kind of massive force deployed in Everett.
The preventive approach was resource-intensive and often politically contentious, as it required acting on incomplete intelligence and accepting higher rates of false positives.
But the alternative, allowing networks to mature until they required military-style assaults on American soil, was increasingly viewed as untenable. The final image that lingered, the one that residents would recall years later when discussing the Whitlock case, was not of the courtroom or the warehouse assault. It was of the surgical chamber in his basement, photographed in forensic detail during the initial raid. The stainless steel tables, the overhead lights, the instruments arranged with clinical precision. The room looked like any hospital operating theater, sterile and professional, and that resemblance was precisely what made it horrifying. It represented the weaponization of healing, the perversion of medical ethics, the transformation of spaces designed for care into mechanisms of exploitation. Federal prosecutors had displayed photographs of the chamber during Whitlock's trial, and the jury's reaction had been visceral, a collective recoil that no amount of legal argument could overcome. The chamber became a symbol, referenced in articles about medical ethics, in policy discussions about oversight, in community conversations about trust and its limits. And when the house was eventually demolished after being seized as proceeds of criminal activity, the basement was filled with concrete before the structure came down, a gesture that felt both practical and symbolic, an attempt to bury something that could never fully be erased. The demolition was attended by several of the rescued hostages, now at various stages of recovery and reintegration. They did not speak to media, did not make statements. They simply watched as the house collapsed, as the debris was cleared, as the lot was graded and left empty. Their presence was enough, a quiet assertion that they had survived, that Whitlock's network had not succeeded in reducing them to the use-value assessments found in his files, that despite everything, they remained human, with agency and dignity intact.
The lot remained vacant for 2 years before being purchased by a family with no connection to the case, who built a modest home that looked like every other house on the block.
Ordinary, unremarkable, defined by the hope that normalcy could be reconstructed even on ground that had witnessed profound darkness. Years after the trial concluded, after the convictions were secured and the sentences began, Seattle conducted a formal review of the case, assembling a commission to evaluate what had failed and what had worked.
The commission's report, released after 18 months of investigation, was both damning and measured.
It identified specific oversight failures, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and cultural factors that had enabled Whitlock's network to develop. But it also acknowledged the complexity of preventing sophisticated criminal operations that exploited institutional legitimacy, noting that perfect security would require surveillance and control measures incompatible with civil liberties.
The report made recommendations that were adopted with varying degrees of success, implemented through municipal codes, estate legislation, and federal policy adjustments.
But the commissioners, in their final session, acknowledged that the most important recommendation could not be codified.
It was cultural, a sustained commitment to skepticism without cynicism, to engagement without naivety, to the understanding that institutions were only as trustworthy as the people within them and the oversight mechanisms that held them accountable. That cultural shift, the report concluded, would take generations to fully realize, and its success would be measured not in dramatic interventions, but in the quiet, continuous work of citizens who refused to assume that authority equaled integrity. The older residents who testified before the commission nodded at that conclusion, recognizing in it an echo of the values they had been taught in different times, values that had proven both essential and insufficient. The younger commissioners accepted it with pragmatic resolve, understanding that the work would be endless, that every generation would face its own Whitlocks, and that the only defense was vigilance maintained long after headlines faded and public attention moved elsewhere. But something fundamental had shifted in the community during those quiet hours that followed the raid. The neighbors who had woken to the sound of the battering ram, who had watched federal agents swarm a house they passed every day, began asking questions they had never thought to ask before. The surgical chamber beneath Whitlock's home had not appeared overnight. The shell corporations had required years to establish. The network of compromised officials had taken deliberate cultivation. And all of it had happened in plain sight, hidden only by the assumption that someone with credentials, with institutional authority, with a clean professional reputation, could not possibly be capable of such systematic evil. That assumption had been Seattle's blindness, and its correction would demand more than policy reforms or enhanced audits. It would require a fundamental recalibration of how communities engage with the institutions meant to serve them, how they balance trust against scrutiny, and how they ensure that the people granted authority understand that accountability follows them into every room, every decision, every signature. The Whitlock case had exposed rot that went deeper than one man's basement, and the process of excavation, though painful, revealed something else beneath the corruption. It revealed a community capable of confronting its failures without succumbing to them, capable of demanding justice while maintaining its commitment to civil norms, and capable of understanding that the work of building trustworthy institutions was never finished, only continued.